Most people are trained from childhood to say yes. Yes to requests they resent. Yes to favors that drain them. Yes to obligations that serve everyone except themselves. And that single habit, that reflexive compliance, disguised as politeness, is the reason most men walk through life feeling like they are living someone else's schedule, someone else's priorities, someone else's version of who they should be. What you are about to learn is why the art of setting boundaries, the ability to say no, calmly, clearly, and without apology, is not rudeness. It is the highest form of self-respect available to you, and it is the one skill that separates people who are respected from people who are merely liked. This is about assertiveness training in its purest form, backed by neuroscience and ancient wisdom. Here is what nobody tells you about agreeableness. It is expensive. A joint study conducted by researchers Timothy Judge, Beth Livingston, and Charles Hurst, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 2012, analyzed data from over 10,000 workers across 3 independent samples and found that agreeable men earned considerably less than their disagreeable counterparts, with the income gap reaching approximately 18%, not because agreeable people are less competent, but because they are less willing to assert boundaries, negotiate aggressively, or say no when a situation does not serve them. The world reads your compliance as a signal, and the signal it receives is that your time, your energy, and your priorities are negotiable. This pattern often begins in childhood through what John Bowlby called insecure attachment. Bowlby's attachment theory, developed through decades of research on infant caregiver bonds, reveals that children who learn their love is conditional on compliance develop what we now recognize as people-pleasing behaviors. When a child's emotional needs are only met when they are agreeable, their developing brain learns that approval equals survival. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, becomes hyperactive around potential rejection, while the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational decision-making, struggles to override these deep survival patterns. This is why saying no feels like a physical threat to so many adults. Their neural pathways were carved by childhood experiences of conditional love. The ancient world understood this with a precision that modern self-help has almost entirely lost. Baltasar Gracián, a 17th century Spanish Jesuit priest and philosopher, wrote one of the most strategically ruthless books ever published. His 1,647 work, The Art of Worldly Wisdom, contained 300 maxims on power, influence, and human nature that were so dangerously honest that his own Jesuit superiors censured him for publishing it. In Maxim 70, Gracián wrote something that should be carved into every desk and door frame you own. Know how to say no. You cannot grant everything to everybody. Saying no is as important as saying yes, and knowing when to do so is the supreme expression of good judgment. Gracián understood that every yes you give without intention is a withdrawal from your own reserves, and a man who cannot refuse becomes a resource for everyone else and a stranger to himself. This connects directly to a concept in modern psychology that explains why saying no feels so physically uncomfortable. The term is social exchange theory, developed by sociologist George Homans in the 1950s and later refined by Peter Blau. Social exchange theory proposes that all human relationships operate on an implicit economy of costs and rewards. When someone asks you for a favor, your brain automatically runs a calculation. The cost of saying no, which includes potential social rejection, guilt, and conflict, versus the cost of saying yes, which includes lost time, energy, and autonomy. For most people, the fear of social punishment outweighs the loss of personal resources, and that calculation is exactly where manipulation lives. The neuroscience confirms this at a biological level. Research by Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA, published in Science in 2003, demonstrated through brain imaging that social rejection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain, specifically the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula. Your amygdala responds to a disappointed look the same way it responds to a physical threat, flooding your system with stress hormones, while your prefrontal cortex desperately tries to rationalize why you should comply. That is not weakness. That is 10,000 years of evolutionary wiring telling you that exclusion from the group meant death on the savannah. But you do not live on the savannah anymore, and the person asking you to work late on a Friday is not your tribal chief deciding whether you eat tonight. Recognizing the difference between ancestral programming and present reality is the first step toward overriding a reflex that no longer serves you. This is where you need to understand what clinical psychology identifies as codependency, a term that often gets misused but has a precise meaning in therapeutic contexts. Codependency, first recognized by researchers studying families of alcoholics, describes a pattern where someone's sense of self becomes so enmeshed with others' needs that they lose the ability to distinguish their own emotions from those around them. This creates what Harriet Bryker, a clinical psychologist and author, identified in her 2001 book, The Disease to Please, as the approval addiction cycle, a pattern where people become so dependent on external validation that they lose the ability to refuse requests without experiencing genuine psychological distress. Her clinical work revealed that chronic people pleasers do not say yes because they are generous. They say yes because saying no triggers anxiety, guilt, and a deep fear of abandonment that can mirror withdrawal symptoms from substance dependency. The neurological pathway is nearly identical. The anterior cingulate cortex, the brain region responsible for detecting social rejection, activates in people pleasers at a far higher rate than in those with healthy boundaries. Assertiveness training, the psychological intervention specifically designed to address these patterns, was pioneered by psychologist Joseph Wolpe in the 1950s and later popularized by Manuel Smith in his groundbreaking 1975 book, When I Say No, I Feel Guilty. Smith recognized that most people never learned the fundamental skill of assertiveness, the ability to express your needs, set boundaries, and refuse unreasonable demands while maintaining respect for both yourself and others. What Smith understood, and what modern neuroscience has confirmed, is that assertiveness is not aggression. Aggression violates others' rights to get your needs met. Passivity violates your own rights to meet others' needs. Assertiveness protects everyone's rights by communicating clearly and directly. Now let us examine why manipulative people specifically target those who cannot say no, because this is where the strategic dimension becomes critical. Robert Cialdini, a professor of psychology at Arizona State University, published Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion in 1984, and it remains one of the most important books ever written on how human compliance works. Cialdini identified 6 principles of influence, and 3 of them are directly weaponized against people who struggle with refusal. The first is reciprocity. Someone does you a small, unsolicited favor, and your brain immediately creates a debt that must be repaid. The second is commitment and consistency. Once you have said yes to something small, your brain pressures you to remain consistent by saying yes to progressively larger requests. This is called the foot in the door technique, and it was first demonstrated experimentally by Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser at Stanford University in 1966. Their study found that people who agreed to a small initial request were far more likely to comply with a much larger request later, because the brain craves consistency between past behavior and present action. The third principle is social proof. You see others complying, so you assume compliance is the correct behavior. Together, these 3 mechanisms form a trap that is almost invisible to the person caught in it. Chanakya, the ancient Indian strategist and philosopher who lived around 350 to 275 BCE, understood this dynamic centuries before modern psychology named it. Chanakya served as the chief advisor to Emperor Chandragupta Maurya and authored the Arthashastra, one of the most comprehensive treatises on statecraft, strategy, and human behavior ever written. In it, Chanakya warned that a king who cannot refuse petitions will be devoured by those who petition him. His advice was not about cruelty or indifference, but about strategic resource management. Chanakya taught that every concession must serve a purpose, and a leader who gives freely without strategic calculation does not earn loyalty, he earns contempt. The people around him learn that his boundaries are suggestions, and they begin to take without asking. This principle translates directly to modern life. When you say yes to every request at work, your colleagues do not admire your generosity. They learn that your time is available, your energy is accessible, and your priorities can be overridden by anyone bold enough to ask. This psychological pattern is what trauma therapist Pete Walker identified as the fawning response, one of 4 survival strategies alongside fight, flight, and freeze. Walker's research on complex PTSD revealed that people who grew up in unpredictable or emotionally volatile environments often develop fawning as their primary defense mechanism. They learn to anticipate others' needs, suppress their own wants, and maintain peace through compliance. This creates what psychologists call learned helplessness, a condition first documented by Martin Seligman, where repeated exposure to uncontrollable situations teaches someone they have no agency. even when they actually do. Chanakya's strategic framework went even deeper than simple refusal. In the Arthashastra, Book 7, he outlined a system of 4 instruments of statecraft: Sama, which means conciliation; Dana, which means gifts; Beda, which means division; and Danda, which means punishment. The first instinct of most people when confronted with a demand is to use Sama, to conciliate, to smooth things over, to agree in order to maintain peace. Chanakya argued that a leader who defaults to conciliation in every situation trains his opponents to make increasingly aggressive demands, because they learn that pressure produces compliance. The strategically wise person understands when conciliation serves their interests and when it simply subsidizes someone else's entitlement. That distinction is the difference between diplomacy and doormat behavior, and most people never learn to draw the line because they were never taught that the line exists. This connects to Julian Rotter's concept of locus of control, developed in the 1950s to describe whether people believe their outcomes are determined by their own actions, internal locus, or by external forces beyond their control, external locus. People with an external locus of control are far more likely to develop people-pleasing behaviors because they believe their safety and success depend entirely on others' approval. Cognitive behavioral therapy specifically addresses this by helping people recognize the thoughts and beliefs that drive their behavior and developing new neural pathways that support boundary setting. There is another dimension to this that operates at the level of your personal economy, and understanding it changes everything. Every hour of your day carries an opportunity cost. When you say yes to one thing, you are automatically saying no to everything else you could have done with that time. The problem is that most people make this trade unconsciously. They say yes to the colleague's request without realizing they just said no to their own project. They say yes to the social obligation without realizing they said no to the rest they desperately needed. Stanford economist Paul Romer's concept of the opportunity cost of time suggests that the most productive individuals are not those who do the most, but those who are most selective about what they do. Your yes is a currency, and like any currency, the more freely you spend it, the less value each unit carries. The person who says yes to everything is, in economic terms, inflating their own commitment until it becomes worthless. There is a Japanese concept that captures the refined art of refusal with a subtlety that Western culture rarely achieves. The practice is called Amae and Tatemae. Amae, as described by Japanese psychoanalyst Takeo Doi in his 1971 book The Anatomy of Dependence, refers to the deep human desire to be indulged and accepted by others. Tatemae, by contrast, is the public facade, the socially acceptable response that maintains harmony without necessarily reflecting genuine feeling. In Japanese business culture, direct refusal is considered extremely impolite, so a sophisticated system of indirect refusal evolved over centuries. When a Japanese executive says, "That would be very difficult," or "We will consider it carefully," the message is no, delivered through a culturally refined filter that preserves the relationship while protecting the boundary. What this teaches you is that effective refusal does not require aggression. It requires clarity wrapped in composure. The delivery can be soft, the boundary must be firm. This principle aligns with Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication, a framework specifically designed to express needs and set boundaries without triggering defensive responses. Rosenberg taught that most conflict arises not from what we say, but from how we say it. When you communicate your boundaries using observation rather than judgment, feelings rather than thoughts, needs rather than strategies, and requests rather than demands, you dramatically increase the likelihood that others will respect your limits without becoming defensive or aggressive. The neuroscience behind why boundaries generate respect rather than resentment is something most people get completely wrong. A 2012 study published in the Journal of Consumer Research by researchers Vanessa Patrick and Henrik Hagtvedt found something striking about the language of refusal. Participants who said, "I don't," instead of "I can't," when declining a temptation, were measurably more effective at maintaining their boundaries over time. The researchers discovered that "I don't" is processed by the brain as a statement of identity, a declaration of who you are, while "I can't" is processed as a statement of restriction, something imposed from outside. When you tell someone, "I don't take meetings on Fridays," instead of "I can't meet on Friday," you are not asking for permission or inviting negotiation. You are informing them of a fact about who you are, and the human brain responds to identity statements with far more respect than it responds to excuses. This connects to a broader psychological principle that every strategic thinker needs to understand. The concept is called the pratfall effect, first described by social psychologist Elliot Aronson in a 1966 study published in Psychonomic Science. Aronson found that highly competent individuals who showed occasional imperfections were actually rated as more likable than those who appeared flawless. The strategic insight here is counterintuitive. When you say no and reveal that you have limits, you do not become less attractive to people worth keeping in your life. You become more real, more human, and more respected. The people who leave when you set a boundary are the people who were only there for what you could give them. The ones who stay are the ones who value you as a person rather than as a resource. Your no functions as a filter that sorts the people around you into those two categories. And that filtering process is one of the most valuable things you will ever do for your own peace of mind. Carl Rogers, the founder of person-centered therapy, identified this phenomenon through his research on unconditional positive regard. Rogers discovered that people who receive genuine acceptance for who they are rather than what they do develop stronger self-worth and better boundaries. The paradox is that the more you try to earn love through compliance, the less likely you are to receive genuine love. People are drawn to authenticity, not performance, and your willingness to disappoint others in service of your own integrity signals that you have something valuable to protect. Let us talk about the specific manipulation tactics that people use to override your no, because recognizing these patterns is the difference between being controlled and being in control. The first is guilt induction. And it sounds like this: after everything I have done for you, you cannot even do this one thing for me. This is a direct exploitation of Cialdini's reciprocity principle, and the correct response is to recognize that genuine generosity does not come with invoices. The moment someone presents a ledger of past favors as ammunition for a current demand, they have revealed that their kindness was never kindness at all. It was a transaction with hidden terms. The second tactic is emotional escalation. When your no is met with sudden anger, tears, or dramatic displays of hurt, you are watching a pressure campaign designed to make your boundary more painful than your compliance. The critical thing to understand is that their emotional reaction belongs to them, not to you. A principle that the Stoic philosopher Epictetus expressed when he taught in Nicopolis, Greece. What disturbs people is not events themselves, but their judgments about those events. When someone escalates emotionally in response to your boundary, they are experiencing the discomfort of not getting what they want. That discomfort is not your responsibility to fix, and accepting it as your problem is exactly how people-pleasing patterns perpetuate themselves. The third tactic is the loyalty test, disguised as a request. This sounds like, if you really cared about me, you would do this. This is one of the most insidious forms of manipulation because it reframes your refusal as evidence of a character flaw. The correct response, which you may never need to say out loud but must always hold internally, is that a person who equates your love with your compliance does not want a relationship, they want a servant. The fourth tactic, and arguably the most sophisticated, is manufactured urgency. This is the emergency that appears at the last possible moment, designed to bypass your judgment because there is no time to think. The manipulative colleague who needs your help on a project tonight. The family member who has a crisis that requires your immediate financial assistance. Genuine emergencies exist, of course, but if someone's emergencies consistently coincide with your moments of rest, your deadlines, or your boundaries, the emergencies are not accidents, they are strategies. Now here is where the ancient and modern converge into something you can use starting today. Sun Tzu, writing in The Art of War around the 5th century BCE, made an observation that applies directly to the psychology of refusal. He wrote that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Translated into the context of boundary setting, this means that the most effective refusal is one that never even requires a confrontation. When you establish your boundaries clearly, consistently, and early, most people never test them. The person who announces their standards before anyone has a chance to violate them never needs to defend those standards in the heat of conflict. This is proactive boundary setting, and it is the strategic approach that costs the least energy and produces the most respect. There is a related military concept called deterrence through reputation that applies perfectly here. When a nation is known for defending its borders without hesitation, Other nations rarely test those borders. The same principle operates in personal relationships, professional environments, and social dynamics. When the people around you learn through consistent experience that your no means no, that your boundaries are not starting positions for negotiation, they stop trying to push past them. The initial cost of establishing that reputation might include some uncomfortable conversations, and perhaps the loss of a few people who only valued your compliance. But the long-term return is a life where your time and energy flow toward your own priorities, instead of being hijacked by the agendas of others. This is where Daniel Kahneman's research becomes strategically critical. In his 2011 book, Thinking Fast and Slow, Kahneman demonstrates that human decision-making operates through two systems. System 1 is fast, emotional, and reactive. This is where most people-pleasing happens. Someone makes a request, your amygdala fires, and you say yes before your rational mind can evaluate whether the request serves your interests. System 2 is slow, deliberate, and strategic. This is where boundary setting must happen. The person who masters the art of saying no has learned to pause long enough for System 2 to engage, to move from emotional reaction to strategic response. Gracián echoed this in Maxim 159 of The Art of Worldly Wisdom, where he advised that one should know how to suffer fools, because those who know nobody are known by nobody. The strategic insight buried in this maxim is that social intelligence is not about eliminating difficult people from your life. It is about managing interactions with them in a way that costs you nothing while preserving your reputation and relationships. You can refuse someone gracefully and still leave the door open for future collaboration. The refusal itself is not a weapon aimed at the other person. It is a shield protecting your most valuable resource, which is your own energy and focus. Here are 5 practical techniques you can implement immediately to transform your relationship with the word no. The first technique is the 24-hour buffer. When someone makes a request that requires serious time, energy, or resources from you, do not respond immediately. Instead, say, "Let me think about that and get back to you tomorrow." This single sentence eliminates impulse compliance, gives your rational brain time to evaluate the request against your actual priorities, and communicates to the other person that your commitment is not automatic. Research on decision-making by Daniel Kahneman demonstrates that rapid decisions under social pressure activate System 1 thinking, the fast, emotional, reactive mode, while delayed decisions engage System 2, the slow, rational, strategic mode. Every major decision you make about your time and energy should come from System 2. The second technique is the identity-anchored refusal. Instead of explaining why you cannot do something, state who you are. Replace "I can't stay late tonight because I have plans" with "I don't work past 6 on weekdays." Replace "I can't lend you money because I am saving" with "I don't lend money." The shift from can't to don't transforms your boundary from a negotiable excuse into a non-negotiable identity statement, exactly as Patrick and Hagtvedt's research demonstrated. The third technique is the broken record method, which comes from assertiveness training developed by Manuel Smith in his 1975 book, When I Say No, I Feel Guilty. The technique is simple. When someone pushes back against your boundary, you repeat your position calmly and without elaboration. No new arguments, no additional justifications, no emotional escalation. You simply restate your answer in slightly different words each time. "I appreciate you thinking of me, but I am not available for that." If they push, "I understand it is important to you, and I am still not available." If they push again, "My answer has not changed." The power of this technique lies in its refusal to engage with the manipulation. Most manipulative tactics require your participation to work. The guilt trip needs you to accept guilt. The emotional escalation needs you to mirror the emotion. The loyalty test needs you to prove your loyalty. When you simply repeat your position without engaging with the tactic collapses under its own weight. The fourth technique is what I call the strategic complement refusal. This is designed specifically for professional environments where preserving the relationship is as important as maintaining the boundary. The structure is: acknowledge the person, honor the request, and decline firmly. For example, "That sounds like a great project, and I can tell you have put real thought into it. My current commitments will not allow me to give it the attention it deserves, so I will have to pass." This format makes the other person feel seen and respected, while making your refusal clean and final. There is no opening for negotiation because you have not provided a problem for them to solve. You have not said you are too busy which invites them to suggest a later time. You have not said you do not have the skills, which invites them to reassure you. You have simply stated that you are passing, and you have wrapped that statement in genuine respect. The fifth technique is the preemptive boundary announcement, drawn directly from Sun Tzu's principle of winning before the battle begins. At the start of new relationships, new jobs, or new collaborative projects, state your boundaries clearly before anyone has a chance to test them. I keep my weekends completely free for personal time. I do not respond to messages after 8 in the evening. I take my commitments seriously, which means I only commit to things I know I can deliver. These statements, delivered calmly and without defensiveness at the beginning of a relationship, set the terms of engagement before any conflict arises. People who hear your boundaries early almost never challenge them later, because challenging an established standard requires far more social energy than accepting a new one. There is one final principle that ties everything together, and it comes from a place that most dark psychology channels will never point you toward. The reason you struggle with saying no, the deep reason beneath the tactics and the social pressure and the guilt, is that somewhere along the way, you internalize the belief that your value depends on what you provide to others. That belief is a lie, and it was installed in you by people who benefited from your compliance. Your value does not come from what you give, it comes from who you are. And the person who understands this, truly understands it in their bones, does not need permission to protect their time. They do not need a script for saying no. They do not need to rehearse their refusal in the mirror. They simply know, with the calm certainty of someone who has done the inner work, that their energy is sacred and their boundaries are not up for debate. Research in self-determination theory, developed by psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan at the University of Rochester, identifies 3 fundamental psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy, the need to feel in control of your own actions and decisions, sits at the foundation of psychological well-being. When you chronically sacrifice your autonomy by saying yes when you mean no, you are not simply inconveniencing yourself. You are systematically undermining one of the 3 pillars that your mental health depends on. Deci and Ryan's research, spanning decades of studies across multiple cultures, consistently demonstrates that people who experience higher autonomy report greater life satisfaction, better relationships, and stronger intrinsic motivation. Protecting your ability to choose, which begins with protecting your ability to refuse, is not selfishness. It is psychological self-preservation. The ancient Stoic philosopher Hierocles, who lived in the 2nd century CE, described human relationships as a series of concentric circles. The innermost circle contains only you. The next circle contains your immediate family, then extended family, then local community, then broader society. Hierocles taught that your responsibility diminishes as the circles expand outward, and that a wise person understands they cannot pour endlessly into the outer circles while neglecting the innermost one. This model, sometimes called Hierocles' circle, provides a philosophical framework for prioritization that makes guilt-free refusal possible. When you say no to a request from an outer circle in order to preserve the resources of your inner circle, you are not being selfish. You are being strategically compassionate, because a person who depletes themselves for everyone else eventually has nothing left to offer anyone, including the people who matter most. Gracián wrote in Maxim 52 of The Art of Worldly Wisdom, "Never lose your composure. This is the great aim of wisdom. It requires true superiority, and the greatest perfection of character is self-possession. The man who owns himself, who knows his worth without needing others to confirm it, and who can say no with the same ease that others say yes, that man has achieved something that no amount of money, status, or approval can replicate. He has achieved sovereignty over his own life, and that is where real power begins. Not in controlling others, not in winning every argument, not in making everyone like you. It begins the moment you decide that your respect for yourself is not conditional on anyone else's approval. Every no you speak from that place of inner certainty is not a rejection of the other person. It is an affirmation of yourself, and the world, whether it admits it or not, respects a man who refuses to be consumed far more than it respects a man who agrees to everything and disappears in the process. Your no is not a wall. It is a declaration of exactly where you end and where everyone else begins. And once that line is drawn with clarity and calm, you will find that the people who matter most are the ones who never needed you to erase it in the first place.